March 1945. A cold morning settles over a fenced compound on the edge of a ruined European town. The war is not over yet, but it is moving fast. Inside the camp, women stand in line as they have for months, some longer, coats thin, faces drawn, eyes trained on routine. They expect the usual orders. Roll call, work detail, silence. Instead, U.S. Army personnel arrive carrying unfamiliar items. Flatboards, paper stacked carefully to keep it dry. Small boxes that rattle softly when set down. When the lids open, the women see colors. Charcoal sticks, pencils, brushes, paint. No one speaks. For many of them, drawing had been forbidden for years. Self-expression had been treated as subversion, memory as danger. In camps run by other powers, even scraps of paper could mean punishment. Now, American guards explain, calmly, without threat, that they're allowed to paint, to draw whatever they choose. The women do not reach forward immediately. Some glance at the wire, others at the guards. A few lower their eyes, unsure whether this is a test, a trick, or something more unsettling. Because to be given the means to create, after so long being controlled, is not a simple gift. It raises a deeper question, one shaped by how this war had taught them to expect cruelty, not permission. And that question begins far beyond the fence lines of this camp, in the long road that led them here. By the spring of 1945, the world had entered the final, violent compression of the Second World War. In Europe, Allied armies were crossing the Rhine. German cities lay shattered under sustained bombing. In the Pacific, American forces were advancing island by island, facing entrenched resistance that showed no sign of collapse. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt, but its human cost was still unfolding, camp by camp, convoy by convoy. Across both theaters, the United States military had become responsible for hundreds of detention and internment facilities. These were not a single type of camp. Some held Axis prisoners of war, captured during fighting in North Africa, Italy, France, and the Pacific. Others confined civilian internees, women and children displaced by shifting front lines, suspected collaborators, ethnic minorities, or enemy nationals caught inside Allied-controlled territory. Still others were temporary holding camps, established as the Allies liberated regions previously under German or Japanese rule. Women arrived at these camps by many paths. Some were German civilians evacuated from bombed cities and detained for screening. Some were Eastern European women uprooted by forced labor systems, now classified as displaced persons. Others were Japanese civilians interned in the Pacific or wives and daughters of enemy soldiers taken into custody as Allied forces advanced. Their backgrounds differed, but their recent experiences often shared the same shape: prolonged fear, rigid control, and a daily life stripped of privacy and choice. International law technically governed their treatment. The 1929 Geneva Convention outlined standards for prisoners of war, including food, shelter, medical care, and protection from abuse. Civilian internees were less clearly defined, but oversight from organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross applied pressure on Allied governments to demonstrate compliance with humanitarian norms. For the United States, keenly aware that its actions were being watched by allies, enemies, and future tribunals, this scrutiny mattered. Yet legality was only part of the story. The U.S. Army entered the later years of the war with a growing interest in psychological management. Combat experience had shown that morale, compliance, and mental stability were not secondary concerns. They directly affected security, labor efficiency, and post-war reconstruction. By 1944, American military planners were consulting psychiatrists, psychologists, and social scientists on how captivity affected behavior. especially among civilians and women, whose responses to detention differed markedly from male combatants. Most of these women had lived under systems where expression was dangerous. In Nazi-controlled Europe, unauthorized writing or drawing could be interpreted as resistance. In Japanese-controlled territories, strict discipline and surveillance left little room for individual expression. Even in labor and transit camps, paper was rationed, pencils rare, and art viewed as useless or threatening. Creativity was not neutral. It was uncontrolled thought made visible. So when these women were transferred into American-run camps, the physical conditions often improved first. Rations became more regular. Beatings were rare. Rules were written down rather than shouted. But psychologically, the prisoners remained guarded. Years of war had taught them that kindness could be temporary, and permissions could be revoked without warning. This was the environment in which American administrators began experimenting with programs that went beyond survival. Educational classes, language lessons, handicrafts, and, cautiously at first, drawing and painting, introduced not as entertainment, but as part of a broader effort to observe, stabilize, and understand the people now under U.S. control. The decision did not emerge in isolation. It was shaped by earlier experiences, by stark contrast with how other regimes had run their camps, and by a growing belief that how prisoners behaved when given limited freedom could reveal far more than how they acted under fear. Those contrasts, and the reasoning behind them, become clearer when we look at what captivity had meant elsewhere in this war, and why the American approach felt so foreign to the women holding those brushes for the first time. To understand why the offer to paint and draw unsettled these women so deeply, it is necessary to place the American camps against the broader landscape of wartime detention. Across much of Europe and Asia, captivity during the Second World War had been designed to break people down, not sustain them. In German concentration and labor camps, creative expression was tightly controlled or outright forbidden unless it served propaganda or administrative needs. In Japanese-run POW and civilian camps, discipline was enforced through deprivation, humiliation, and violence, with little regard for long-term psychological survival. In both systems, art had no sanctioned place unless it reinforced authority. Women in particular learned this lesson quickly. In occupied territories, they were expected to endure quietly, working, waiting, surviving. Drawing a face, writing a line of poetry, or sketching a memory of home could be interpreted as defiance or weakness. Even in less overtly brutal facilities, time itself became a weapon. Days blurred together, structured only by commands. Identity narrowed to a number, ration card, a bed assignment. Expression was unnecessary to keep a body alive, and therefore considered expendable. American forces entered this environment with a different set of assumptions, shaped by their own institutional culture. By 1943, the U.S. Army had already conducted extensive studies on combat fatigue and morale among its soldiers. Psychiatrists attached to military units had observed that suppression of emotion led not to obedience, but to breakdown, panic, withdrawal, sudden violence. These findings did not remain confined to the battlefield. They began to influence how the Army thought about captivity as well. Within the Provost Marshal General's office, which oversaw prisoner management, guidelines increasingly emphasized order through predictability rather than terror. Camps were expected to run on schedules. Punishments were formalized. Arbitrary cruelty was discouraged not purely for moral reasons, but because it created instability. A prisoner who felt permanently threatened was harder to manage, more likely to resist passively, sabotage work, or collapse psychologically. This shift opened the door to programs that might have seemed inconceivable earlier in the war. Education was one of them. Another was structured labor designed to occupy time, without exhaustion, and gradually, cautiously, some camps introduced creative activities, initially for children, then for adults. Drawing and painting were among the most controversial. Unlike knitting or woodworking, they produced images. Images could carry memory, ideology, grief, or resentment. For administrators, that risk was also a source of information. Military psychologists argued that art could function as a diagnostic tool. What prisoners chose to draw, homes, weapons, religious symbols, abstract shapes, offered clues to their mental state and political orientation. Were they still fixated on the war, on leaders and flags? Or were they retreating into personal memories, landscapes, faces? For women who had endured displacement and loss, these choices mattered. They revealed how captivity had reshaped their inner lives. But from the prisoner's perspective, none of this context was visible. They did not see policy memoranda or psychological reports. They saw guards who, until recently, had represented another occupying force. They had learned that privileges often came with conditions and that participation could be monitored. The sudden permission to create felt less like freedom and more like exposure. There was also a cultural divide. Many of these women came from societies where art was either highly formalized or deeply private. To be asked by uniformed men under watchtowers to express oneself visually was profoundly unsettling. It removed the protective anonymity that captivity had imposed. Silence had been safe. Expression was risky. And yet, the Americans persisted. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but enough that the pattern became noticeable. In camps across liberated France, Germany, Italy, and parts of the Pacific, reports began to note changes. Reduced tension, fewer disciplinary incidents, a subtle shift in how prisoners related to their captors and to one another. The women who sat with paper and brushes in March 1945 did not know that they were part of a larger experiment in control through calm rather than fear. They only knew that something about this permission felt more dangerous than prohibition, because it asked them to reveal what the war had done to them. And in doing so, it marked the moment when captivity began to change its shape. That change would soon be visible from multiple angles: human, psychological, military, and moral, each revealing a different truth about what those first lines on paper truly meant. For the women in these camps, survival had depended on emotional containment. Grief was managed quietly. Anger was swallowed. Fear became routine. Captivity rewarded those who revealed nothing. Faces remained neutral. Words were measured. Over time, this restraint hardened into habit. When paper was placed in their hands, it disrupted that equilibrium. Drawing demanded choice. A line had to begin somewhere. A shape had to be formed. Even refusal was a decision. For women who had been denied agency for months or years, this was not comforting. It was destabilizing. Some stared at the blank surface for hours. Others made small, careful marks near the edge, as if testing whether the page itself might betray them. A few began immediately, their hands moving faster than thought. What emerged was rarely decorative. Faces without eyes, buildings without doors, crowded lines pressed into narrow spaces. These were not artworks meant for display. They were fragments of internal landscapes that had never been intended to leave the mind. Camp observers noted that after drawing sessions, some women became withdrawn, while others slept more deeply than they had in weeks. The act of externalizing memory, of giving shape to what had been endured, triggered reactions that confinement alone had not. Trauma, once made visible, could no longer remain contained. This was why the experience felt frightening. Expression stripped away the numbness that had made captivity bearable. It reopened pathways of feeling that the war had forced shut. The shock was not that Americans allowed them to draw, but that the women realized how much had been waiting beneath the surface. And once that surface was broken, it could not easily be restored. From the American perspective, these reactions were anticipated. By the mid-1940s, military psychology had moved beyond simple notions of morale. Psychiatrists attached to the Army understood that emotional suppression created long-term instability. Drawing was introduced not as therapy in the modern sense, but as controlled exposure. Prisoners were observed discreetly, not for artistic skill, but for patterns. Did images repeat? Did themes evolve over time? Did hostility toward captors appear symbolically? In women who had lived under authoritarian regimes, symbolism often replaced speech. A broken fence could say what words could not. A distorted human figure could signal fear or aggression without a single spoken complaint. Reports from several camps noted that prisoners who engaged in regular creative activity showed fewer sudden emotional outbursts. Discipline became easier to maintain. Conflicts among detainees decreased. For administrators, this confirmed a belief that expression reduced pressure rather than increasing it. Yet this also meant that drawing was never neutral. It existed within a system of observation. The women sensed this intuitively. Guards watched. Officers collected finished pieces. Some drawings were kept, others quietly removed. The line between permission and surveillance was thin, and everyone knew it. Still, the psychological effect was undeniable. Art created a space, however constrained, where internal chaos could be externalized. It was not freedom, but it was a release valve. And for a system built on control, that release made the entire structure more stable, which raised an uncomfortable question. If art could calm prisoners more effectively than fear, what did that say about the systems that had relied on terror for so long? That question extended beyond psychology into culture itself, into what these women had been taught art was for, and why its sudden return felt like a violation of everything they had learned. For many of these women, art had once been part of ordinary life. Sketching in school, sewing patterns, painting landscapes. The war had erased those habits methodically. Under occupation and in camps, creativity became suspect. Anything that did not serve immediate survival was dangerous. Total war demanded utility. German and Japanese authorities both promoted art that reinforced ideology while suppressing personal expression. Individual memory was a threat. Personal grief distracted from collective obedience. Over time, women learned to associate creativity with punishment or loss. So when Americans offered art materials without ideological instruction, it felt unnatural. There were no slogans to copy, no approved themes. The absence of direction was itself alarming. Freedom without guidance had not existed in their recent experience. Cultural conditioning does not disappear when conditions change. It lingers in the body, in the way hands hesitate, in the way eyes search for approval. These women had been trained to expect rules, not options. That was why the act of drawing felt like stepping into uncertainty. It forced them to confront a version of themselves that the war had tried to erase. And once confronted, that self could not simply be returned to silence. This tension between release and risk, observation and expression, set the stage for deeper implications that reached beyond the prisoners themselves, touching on military strategy, gender captivity, and how the enemy perceived American control. For the U.S. Army, prisoner management was not an abstract moral exercise. It was a logistical problem tied directly to security, manpower, and resources. Every disturbance inside a camp required guards. Every act of defiance disrupted schedules. Calm was not kindness, it was efficiency. By late 1944, American commanders had learned that fear-based control produced diminishing returns. Prisoners subjected to constant intimidation became unpredictable. They feigned compliance while resisting quietly. They fell ill more often. They required more. The first days of drawing passed in near silence. Tables were set up in barracks or communal halls. Guards stood back, instructed not to interfere unless necessary. The women sat apart at first, each enclosed within her own space, shoulders hunched, movements economical. The sound of charcoal against paper replaced conversation. What emerged during those early sessions surprised everyone involved. The Americans had expected caution, perhaps repetition. What they saw instead was intensity. Lines pressed hard enough to tear paper. Forms crowded together, leaving no empty space. Faces appeared again and again, sometimes detailed, sometimes reduced to a few sharp strokes. In some drawings, borders were thick and heavy, enclosing the scene tightly. In others, figures floated without ground, unanchored. Camp psychologists noted the speed with which certain women worked. There was no hesitation. The images seemed to have been waiting. For these prisoners, expression had not disappeared during captivity. It had been compressed. Given an outlet, it surged forward. Yet this release was not immediate relief. After sessions ended, several women withdrew further. Some refused to eat. Others avoided eye contact. Nighttime disturbances increased briefly. Restless movement, murmured speech, sudden waking. The act of drawing had unlocked memories that routine had kept at bay. This was the moment when American administrators faced a decision. They could stop the program, conclude that it was destabilizing, or they could accept that disturbance was part of transition. That pressure did not dissipate cleanly, but shifted. They chose to continue. In reports, sent up the chain of command, officers emphasized the need for consistency. Sessions were scheduled regularly. Materials were replenished. Observation continued, but with less visible scrutiny. The goal became containment, not suppression. Gradually, patterns changed. The women began to sit closer together. They shared pencils. They compared drawings quietly. The content evolved. Early images dominated by confinement gave way to landscapes, remembered streets, fragments of pre-war life. This shift was not uniform, but it was noticeable. The turning point did not arrive with a single dramatic event. It unfolded across weeks in small, cumulative changes. Fewer altercations, improved sleep, a subtle easing of posture. These are the metrics that mattered. Then one afternoon, a woman who had not spoken since arriving at the camp placed her drawing face up on the table and left it there when the session ended. It depicted a simple interior, a table, a window, light entering from outside. No explanation followed. None was required. The act itself marked a change. Silence had been replaced by visibility. And once something had been seen, it altered the balance between captor and captive in ways no regulation could fully control. What followed would deepen that shift, revealing not only the women's inner lives, but the limits and consequences of American authority over them. As weeks passed, the drawings accumulated. Stacks of paper were stored in administrative offices, medical huts, and Red Cross files. Some were cataloged. Others remained anonymous, marked only by date and camp designation. Together, they formed an unintentional archive, one that revealed the inner record of captivity more clearly than any interrogation report. American psychologists began to notice a shift not only in behavior, but in the drawings themselves. Images grew less compressed. White space returned. Figures stood upright rather than folded inward. In several camps, women began depicting sequences rather than isolated scenes, before, during, and after moments of disruption. Narrative had returned. This mattered. Narrative signaled integration. It meant that experience was being processed rather than merely endured. At the same time, the drawings exposed realities the Americans had not fully anticipated. Some images contained symbols associated with former regimes. Flags appeared faintly in backgrounds. Military insignia emerged in distorted form. These were not endorsements, but remnants, evidence of how deeply ideology and war had penetrated daily life. Camp authorities debated how to respond. Suppressing such images would contradict the very principles that made the program effective. Allowing them raised concerns about morale and influence within the camp. In most cases, the decision was made to observe without interference. The presence of these symbols diminished over time, replaced by personal motifs, homes, children, unnamed landscapes. This gradual transformation marked the true turning point. Control was no longer maintained solely through regulation, but through engagement. The women were no longer only detainees. They were participants in a system that, however limited, acknowledged their inner lives. The effect on camp dynamics was measurable. Work details became more orderly. Requests were made through formal channels rather than through withdrawal or defiance. Medical staff reported fewer stress-related complaints. These changes were not dramatic, but they were consistent. Yet the most profound shift occurred quietly. Women who had resisted being seen began to accept visibility on their own terms. They chose what to reveal. They decided what remained private. In a structure defined by imposed boundaries, this small reclaiming of choice altered the psychological terrain. For the Americans, this success carried an unintended consequence. By allowing expression, they had created evidence of suffering that could not be dismissed as enemy exaggeration or wartime necessity. The drawings became moral documents as much as psychological ones. As liberation accelerated and camps prepared for closure or transfer, these documents lingered. They followed some women into displaced persons camps. They entered archives. They were cited in reports that questioned how captivity should be managed in the future. The climax of this story was not a rebellion or an escape. It was a recognition, on both sides, that power exercised without constant cruelty could still expose responsibility, and that once expression was permitted, it could not be neatly contained again. The war would soon end. But the consequences of this quiet experiment would extend far beyond the wire, shaping lives and policies in ways only visible once the camps themselves began to empty. When the European War ended in May 1945, the American-run camps faced immediate transition. Soldiers began processing the departure of prisoners, preparing for repatriation, and closing temporary facilities. For many of the women who had spent months or years behind wire, the world beyond the fences was unfamiliar and frightening. They were no longer under daily surveillance, yet the imprint of captivity remained. The lines they had drawn were among the few tangible markers of continuity and memory. The art programs themselves persisted in modified form during this period. In some camps, Red Cross workers and U.S. psychologists encouraged continued drawing and painting as a way to monitor mental health, document trauma, and assist in post-war rehabilitation. These activities provided women with tools to articulate experiences that could not be spoken aloud. The drawings were sometimes collected in binders, photographed for archives, or included in reports on psychological stabilization. Immediate effects were evident. Discipline within the camps had improved markedly since the introduction of creative programs. Records show a reduction in altercations, nighttime disturbances, and escape attempts. Camp reports credited these improvements to the combination of structured activity and controlled autonomy. Soldiers noted that women who participated in drawing sessions were more cooperative during roll calls and work details, not because of coercion, but because the act of expression had allowed internal tension to be released in a regulated environment. Medical officers also observed changes. Sleep patterns stabilized, digestive complaints decreased, and emotional outbursts became less frequent. One camp psychologist reported that the act of creating, even under supervision, allowed for processing of trauma in ways we could not achieve through conventional discipline. These findings influenced decisions on similar programs elsewhere, particularly in camps holding civilian internees or displaced persons. The art itself became a mirror to war's impact. Landscapes revealed memories of destroyed homes. Faces, sometimes faceless, reflected loss and displacement. Domestic scenes, kitchens, family members, familiar streets, offered glimpses of lives interrupted but not erased. For the women, these images were personal, yet they simultaneously served as evidence of endurance, a private record of identity maintained under duress. Even as the immediate war crisis faded, the practice of allowing controlled creative expression began to influence broader discussions within military administration. Some commanders suggested expanding educational and artistic programs as part of post-war reconstruction and rehabilitation. Others remained cautious, fearing misinterpretation or misuse of the images. Yet the trend was clear: expression, when managed carefully, was an effective tool for stability, observation, and psychological care. This measured success, however, did not erase all pain. The war's physical and emotional devastation lingered. Many women faced repatriation to destroyed homes, broken families, or uncertain political climates. The drawings could not restore what had been lost, but they did provide a bridge, a reminder that, even in captivity, personal agency could survive. These immediate outcomes laid the foundation for the longer-term consequences of this policy, how it would affect the post-war lives of these women, the preservation of their works, and a historical understanding of American camp management in the final months of the conflict. In the months following liberation, the women who had participated in the art programs carried fragments of the camp experience with them. Some were transferred to displaced persons, DP, camps, where the chaos of post-war Europe continued to challenge survival. Others returned home to cities and villages reduced to rubble. Yet for many, the drawings remained a tangible record, a reminder that, amid confinement, they had retained some measure of control over their inner lives. These works were preserved in a variety of ways. Camp authorities sometimes retained copies for psychological study. Red Cross personnel documented selections to inform post-war humanitarian policy. In some cases, families who received repatriated women also received the drawings, which were carefully folded or rolled with personal effects. Today, many of these pieces exist in archives across the United States and Europe, cataloged as evidence of civilian experience under Allied detention. They are not celebrated as masterpieces. They are records, raw and unfiltered, of endurance, memory, and adaptation. Beyond physical preservation, the art programs shaped the women's mental and emotional resilience. By engaging in creative expression, prisoners were able to process trauma more actively than through forced silence. Post-war interviews with former detainees often reference these sessions as moments of subtle empowerment. One survivor noted, decades later, that being allowed to draw was terrifying at first, but it reminded me that I still had a mind of my own. Small acts of choice like this helped women rebuild confidence in themselves as they confronted the larger uncertainties of post-war life. The broader historical significance of these programs also emerged over time. Military reports, psychological studies, and subsequent scholarship recognized that U.S. policies differed sharply from Axis detention practices. Where fear had once dominated, observation and controlled autonomy had achieved order and insight without widespread abuse. This approach influenced not only post-war humanitarian standards, but also early thinking on trauma care, civilian rehabilitation, and the ethics of military governance. Importantly, the women's response demonstrated that permission, even within strict boundaries, could profoundly reshape behavior. Calm authority, when combined with carefully managed autonomy, allowed prisoners to reclaim agency in small but meaningful ways. It showed that power did not always require intimidation to be effective, and that human resilience could manifest quietly through pencil and paper under conditions that had once demanded silence. Ultimately, these outcomes extended beyond the immediate camp environment. They left a trace in post-war psychology, military policy, and humanitarian practice, illustrating how the seemingly simple act of drawing could influence both individuals and institutions. And they led naturally to a final reflection on what this intersection of war, captivity, and expression reveals about humanity itself, its vulnerabilities, its endurance, and its capacity for recovery. In the quiet aftermath of war, when fences were dismantled and the soldiers had gone, the drawings remained. They were neither decoration nor propaganda. They were testimony, fragments of inner lives that had endured hunger, fear, and displacement. Each line traced memory, grief, or longing. Each shaded corner reflected a mind slowly reclaiming itself after years of imposed silence. The significance of this episode extends beyond the camp itself. It demonstrates that human resilience is not only physical, but psychological. In a system built on control, the smallest permissions, a pencil, a brush, a sheet of paper, became instruments of subtle liberation. They revealed that power exercised through calm observation could be as transformative and perhaps as revealing as power enforced through fear. For the women, drawing was a mirror of survival. It documented absence and loss, yet it also preserved identity, offering a bridge between the self they had been and the self they could rebuild. For the Americans, it offered insight, a reminder that humane administration does not weaken authority, but can reinforce it, creating order through understanding rather than coercion. And for history, these moments serve as a quiet counterpoint to the broader narrative of war. They remind us that even amid immense destruction, small acts of humanity leave lasting legacies. They show that captivity is not only a matter of confinement, but of what is allowed to survive within the mind. They teach that art, simple, unassuming, and profoundly human, can illuminate the darkest corners of conflict. In the end, the women's drawings testify to a truth that transcends war, that even under the strictest control, the human spirit finds a way to leave its mark, and in doing so, reminds the world of its enduring capacity for memory, reflection, and resilience.